I must have been about 4, right? And this other mixed race kid came up to me and he was like, "Hey, you're half caste like me." And I was like, "What?" He was like, "Yeah, you're half caste." And I was like, "Oh, I'm half caste." All of the nerves in my wrist, my artery popped out of my wrist, and like blood went everywhere. I lost like 2 pints of blood. One of the guys was like, "Right, I'm gonna kill him." All the questions I was asking, I was also struggling with like, what is reality? Like I was at this crazy crunch point.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Roots to Roots. This is the show where we really get to explore what we can learn about ourselves, our identity, and what we're really driven to achieve through understanding the stories of those that came before us. And through that, we get to see how our perspective of modern culture really influences the purpose that we hold. Today's guest is a perfect example of what this podcast stands for. He is someone with a deep understanding of history, and I cannot wait to dive into his story. So Nuakai, welcome.
Thank you. How's it going?
There's this quote, which I know you've pulled from somewhere, but the way you delivered it really stood out to me. So you were saying that a person without knowledge of their own history is like a tree without roots. What is your understanding of your roots?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great quote. I mean, I initially learned that quote from Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican and created a movement in the early 1900s of about 6 million African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans, encouraging them to return back to Africa to overcome the oppression that they had faced in the New World. And I think the quote specifically is more like, a people without knowledge of their history is like a tree without roots. And really, I really resonated with that so much, because I think for me, I'm of mixed heritage. My father is Jamaican and my mother's British. And on my Jamaican side, we're made up of many different African tribes, the indigenous Arawak or Tano peoples, and then also potentially aspects of Europeans as well in Jamaica. And then on my mother's side, my family's made up of English people, what's also mixed with Scottish and some Irish. But growing up, I didn't really have any understanding around that history. You know, my family wasn't a family that was very well versed in their own ancestral history. They were just living more from where they're at, what they're doing in their day and their time. And you know, I was born in London, in North London, and I grew up just right near to Wood Green. And I lived in a very sort of Caribbean, African and mixed British environment for my first early years. And I remember when I first went to primary school, being around, I must have been about 4, right? And this other mixed race kid came up to me and he was like, "Hey, you're half caste like me." And I was like, "What?" He was like, "Yeah, you're half caste." And I was like, "Oh, I'm half caste." And I went back to my mum that evening, and I don't really remember this experience. I kind of do, but I more remember it from my mum telling me the story of it. And my mum was like, "You came home and you were like, I'm half caste." And I was like, "Oh yeah, you're half caste." And it's so crazy to think, jumping forward, that I look back and as a kid, I was being introduced to a concept of being half of something. And being of a caste. And I think my mum never really understood the history or the awareness of culture and ethnicity in that time. And I certainly didn't. But then I got put into that box of being half caste. And I look back at it now and I realize, look, I'm not half of anything. I'm fully whole. You know, I have millions of ancestors on both lines of my family. And we're all connected, really. When we look back over human history, we are all connected. We're all part of the human family tree. We're just different branches and different lines. Yeah. But I didn't understand or know that at all growing up. So it's taken me a long journey of like real authentic investigation, truth seeking, and really seeking knowledge of self to understand that. Because until I did gain that insight, I was very lost in this concept of being a half of something or a half caste. You know, in a world where white supremacy was having a major dominant effect in culture, in society, in jobs, in work, in identity. And then the concepts of being black was portrayed many times in many negative lights and many negative viewpoints. And so growing up in Britain with these dynamics of where do you find yourself? Are you black? Are you white? Are you half caste? Are you mixed race? Are you mixed heritage? How do you define who you are? Or are you defined by other people? Or how do you learn to define yourself? You know?
It's interesting because looking at some of the guests that I've had on, a lot of the time the case is that the cultural contrast or the cultural challenges that they face is they've grown up in a place that's different to their background heritage. So someone like me, growing up in London, but my parents have this East African Indian descent, but my ethnicity or heritage still stems from the same thing as them, right? So it's, I have a relation to their cultural values, but then it's different to the environment I grew up in. In your case, it seems to be that there's another dynamic where, by the sounds of it, your parents aren't of mixed heritage, right? Separately. So you're almost in this space of, there's the culture and environment you grew up in, and then there's two separate cultures above you. So you're not either one of them. So how do you deal with that? Like, where was your relation point to that identity of, where do you even start to look at who am I and where do I fit in when you don't have that, you know, role model-esque role of your parents to relate to in that sense?
No, that's a great question. I think it's funny, we had a dog, right? And the dog's name was Jeb, what was my mum's and dad's initials. And the dog had white, light brown, dark brown spots. And it was so funny because, like, as a kid, I really observed the dog and identified the different complexions of my mum and my dad and me, because we all three were different complexions, you know, like my dad was dark brown, I was light brown, and my mum wasn't white, but she was much more light, you know. Like, I don't believe in the concepts of white. There's not white people, there's not black people, right? You know, there's different shades of people, from like a very light hue to a very dark hue, right? And all the colors in between. But just as a child, these three different pigment colors on the dog are related to us. And, you know, we had Greek neighbors, we had African neighbors, we had British neighbors, we had Caribbean, Jamaican, Trinidadian neighbors, right? So, you know, when I went to school, again, in London, it was very multicultural. And I think growing up for me as a kid, as a child, I didn't really see these sort of color bars as much, right? You know, I experienced a lot of love from my family. There was a lot of social dynamics, issues going on between my parents. You know, they both had very different cultures they grew up in. They came together through love, through passion, through interest, through intrigue. And then I think, you know, having children for any generation, any group of people is a challenge, right? Like, what brings you together initially puts you on a particular path. And then when you have children, how you were raised comes out and becomes, either flows or it challenges one another, you know? If one person's ideal of doing one thing is one thing and another person's ideal is a different, and you're stuck in those ways because that's how you were raised, then that can cause clashes. And I think my journey very much was, my parents clashed a lot, and then by the time I was about 4.5, 5, my mum left my dad, and then we went to live with my mum's parents in a really small rural village in Bedfordshire. And then I was the only person of colour in that village, right? And so I went from, you know, being identified as half caste, but really not really understanding it. And as a child, I really saw myself probably more akin to my dad. You know, my dad was this real strong, stoic, but also fun man. You know, he was very straight up, solid character. And as a kid, you know, like, he taught me to swim, he taught me to ride my bike, you know. So I had a really good relationship with him as a child. And, you know, so I kind of walked like him. I looked like a lighter version of him. So I identified a lot to my dad. And then I went to live in a very British environment where I was the only person of colour. And my English family, because on the surface, as much as if I trace their ancestral lines back, they've got different mixes going on as well. But on the surface, they're an English family, right? And, you know, my English family gave me a lot of love. They loved me. But at the same time, there was always a bit of a running joke. Like, my granddad, there was a running joke about my granddad that he never knew he was racist until his daughter brought a black man home. Wow. That was like one of those like running jokes, right? Now, my granddad really got on with my dad. They were cool. And my granddad loved me, you know, like, he taught me to play golf. You know, we used to go on lots of country trips. You know, I learned about trees and stars and plants and animals. He grew up in Blockley, so he grew up in much more rural England. So he had a good relationship with the earth and the land. And so he taught me a lot of that stuff. But at the same time, he was in the Second World War. You know, he was a sergeant in the Second World War, and he was a military trainer. So he taught people like a lot of fitness and physical education and strength training and skills. And he was a very serious guy, but also had a playful side, but was very serious. But again, taught me a lot of things, loved me a lot. But it's funny, right? Because he never ever took me to the golf course. So he taught me to play golf in the garden, and my English cousin, him and my granddad and my uncle used to always go to the golf course. And my granddad was always like, no, you don't listen well enough, and would never take me to the golf course. So it's not until I was like in my 20s and I watched the Tiger Woods biography, and I was like, wow, golf courses were really racist environments, man. Like, wow. And so actually, that was why he never took me. And so as much as my granddad loved me, he didn't really necessarily know what I could achieve in society, and didn't really understand the dynamics that I was struggling with, right? And I think actually my English family didn't really understand or identify properly the racial issues and dynamics that were happening to me as a child, right? So like, I'll just give you an example. Like my first day of primary school, when I went in the English countryside, so I went from a very multicultural inner city London school to being the only kid of colour in a rural primary school. And on my first day at lunchtime, I put an orange peel in my mouth, right? And you know, you can put the orange peel here, like you're smiling. And then I was chasing the little boys and girls around the playground. We were just playing and fun, having a laugh. And my grandma had taught me that, you know, my English grandma had taught me that, you know, put the orange peel in your mouth and like you can go, right, just for fun. And this teacher saw me chasing these kids and was like, what are you doing? And made me sit outside the headmistress's office for the rest of the day. And I was like, probably around 5. And that was the sort of stuff that began to happen regularly. Now, when I look back on that, a child chasing other children at lunchtime, there's nothing wrong with that. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But really, the dynamic was a English teacher saw a child of colour chasing English children around the playground and didn't like that.
It was almost like a dissonance of like an understanding of what's happening.
Yeah, and so from a young age, I started to get labelled a lot from that perspective. You know, just my presence was a problem in a lot of environments because of the racial dynamics that was going on in society at that time. You know, the first day I went to Cubs, running around, having a great day, because one of my friends went to Cubs, and then when my mum comes to pick me back up, the guy said, yeah, don't bring him back. This is not really right for him. And my mum just was like, oh, really? So, and they often used to just link it to my behavior.
Yeah.
So again, even inside my family, you know, it's not until years later that I started to research history and African culture and Caribbean culture, and then understand the dynamics of colonialism and slavery and the constructs of the concept of race in itself. Did I even understand what were these dynamics that I was being affected by as a child, right? You know, like my family loved me, but in the wider society, I was dealing with racism from a very young age, and certain levels of oppression and a lots of injustice. But my family weren't able to identify it and see it for what it was. So they also kind of labeled me, right? And my family, because of probably to them, in some ways, I was the exotic member of the family. You know what I mean? Like my mum grew up in a very strict family. So her thing was to let me be free. She went the opposite. She was like, let me just let him be free. So again, I didn't probably get enough boundaries, enough solid boundaries. So on top of these other dynamics, I was a adventureful, bright, confident, communicative, little young to the wider world black child that was seen and heard. And in that generation, you know, children, for one, were very from that old school thing, you should be seen and not heard as a child. And if you're black and a black child, you should be seen, not heard, and be submissive. And I was not any of those things. I was loud, I was communicative, I was adventurous, I was competitive. I was a fun kid, you know, like I look at my nephew, like he's very similar to me in many ways, you know, he's bright and he's often very misunderstood, right? He just needs his energy to be channeled. So all of these different dynamics were going on. And because my parents had separated and I was living with my grandparents, I also was being told lots of different rules.
Yeah.
You know, everyone had different opinions. So as a young age, I started to think, I don't really know which adult to listen to, you know, because I'm getting so many different perspectives. And then when I got sent to boarding school, I went to quite a well-to-do boarding school in Gloucestershire. And it was a very harsh boarding school, you know. I remember I was jumping up and down on the bed the first day I got there, like excited. I was in a new place. I was ready for the adventure. And this teacher came in called Mr. Wolf, grabbed me by the scruff of my neck, threw me into the bedpost and went, "Don't ever jump on your bed.
Wow.
You're not at home anymore, boy."
Yeah.
And walked out, and I remember being like, oh dear, I don't know where I've been left here. Like, this is not feeling like a safe environment. And you know what, just part of my life story is I spent nearly a year at that school, experienced a lot of bullying, a lot of fighting, a lot of racism from older children, teachers, and then kids in my year used to try and call me, like, you know, gollywog and black magic and like the N-word and things like that. And I was never totally passive, so I would always, you know, run my mouth back or call them names back, and then I would often get beaten up by the older kids, or I'd try and escape. And I had a certain level of resilience because when I went to live with my grandparents, I started doing martial arts. So around 6, 7, I did a bit of Japanese jiu-jitsu and a bit of kickboxing.
Just on that, so like because you mentioned earlier about how disciplined your granddad was there influence of those traits where the sort of disciplined approach that he had may have trickled down then to your the next generation and then to you, where it then led to, I mean, everything that you've gone on to do now, but even starting back at that point, like going into the discipline of martial arts, which does require that kind of thing. Do you see how that influence stemmed from those generations?
I think you're right, definitely. I think I really resonated with the structure that my granddad had for things. But he wasn't very emotive. He wasn't a very emotionally communicative person, and he didn't necessarily look at a bigger dynamic of life in the world. He just was he was in his lane, and then he was structured and well functioned in his lane. He wasn't really checking so many other lanes, and I didn't totally fit in his lane. You know, I learned from lots of aspects of his lane, but in his eyes, and probably in my eyes, I didn't really know how to fit in his lane. It's quite funny because, again, I didn't really understand or know properly until years later that he was like a personal trainer in the army and he became a sergeant, right? Because then years later I became a martial arts personal trainer and I teach martial arts, right? It's funny. So it's like these things are often innately within us and they pass down, whether you have been consciously taught about it or you've just found it yourself, you know, like you've got these innate skills that have kind of like been dormant in your DNA that you just reawaken if you want to.
And even the curiosity that you mentioned, that you were, I mean, it's so clear that you have this curiosity to explore your heritage and where that came from. Where do you think that curiosity was driven from? Do you think the circumstances that you raised in, that you were spoken about, and then going to the boarding school was the driving force behind what got you to question who am I and where have I come from and what are my descendants? Or do you think that curiosity was something that was always there?
Yeah, I guess, good question. I mean, simple answer is I think I've always been a curious spirit, right? I've always been a questioner. You know, that's kind of how I learn. You know, I look at the plant and I'll be like, wow, like why does it leaves open like that? And why is there that pattern in the leaves? You know, I would always just be curious. And in the countryside, I just loved nature. You know, like I was a bit like a cross between Tarzan and David Attenborough, right?
I like that.
Yeah. You know, like some people bust joke and say, you know, I'm like Blackenborough, right? Because I've always been fascinated by, you know, frogs, newts, all kinds of animals, insects, plants. And what's really cool now is like I've got 2 daughters, and my oldest one already off of her own back is just loves the natural world. She already knows plants even better than I do, actually. She's got a really good memory for them. So it's interesting how that, again, because my grandparents were interested in plants. And on one side of my family, and again on the other side of my family, my dad's side of the family, we've always been into, like, you know, we've owned parrots and snakes and lizards. You know, my dad used to go spearfishing and catch wild food and stuff like that. So, you know, again, these sort of innate skills that were in my ancestral line have kind of come through me, and now I see it's growing in my children as well. But what I was going to say to you is, when I was in boarding school, I nearly died in the first school I was at, because one of the kids in my year thought he could get away with calling me certain names, and so I chased after him. And he was kind of, you know, I wouldn't say he wasn't like he was being an evil, malicious child. He was just calling me racist slurs. And as a young kid, he didn't even know what those racist slurs were, really, right? If we break it down, he was just trying to get a reaction out of me, right? And he got a reaction because, again, I was dealing with so many other things. And as much as I was angry and trying to get him, I was also like kids chasing each other, right? So I chased after him, and then he slams this glass door back in my face. My hand went out, and my hand smashed through the glass, and the glass just fully cut through my wrist, sliced through my main artery, all of the nerves in my wrist. My artery popped out of my wrist, and like blood went everywhere. I lost like 2 pints of blood, nearly passed out. You know, all these kids ran over to me, and they all ran away at the same time, just freaked out by all this blood everywhere. I kind of wandered off into this out of bounds part of the school, eventually got found by the nurse, taken to hospital, and they did 4 hours of microsurgery on my wrist, right, stitching together the artery and all of the nerves. And I was right-handed, and I was always very, like, you know, I was an amazing climber as a kid, right? I used to do the craziest, climb up a tree and jump from one tree to another tree and swing from branches. Like, I used to just I was very free. Like, you know, like before parkour, I was doing parkour as a kid, right? And then I lost the use of my right hand. And so in classes and lessons, I now had to start using my left hand. So, you know, when you're a child, moving up to the age of around 8, when you start writing as a child and get to around 8, if you write with your right hand, it helps the left hemisphere of your brain form, right? If you write with your left hand, it helps more of the right hemisphere of the brain form, right? And I know there's different perspectives about the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. But again, at around 8, I then lost the use of my right hand when I just started to get more comfortable writing. Now I had to write with my left hand, so I couldn't keep up in the class. So it was much harder to work. I was mildly dyslexic at the time anyway. And then now I couldn't write and keep up. And then I didn't get the right support for physio. And then I didn't get the right support in classes. And then my mum obviously thought it wasn't safe for me to stay in that school, nearly died. So I went to a different school. And I basically I got kicked out of that school for something that was nothing to do with me again. Then I went to another school, got kicked out of that school for being more misunderstood. And then I went to a referral unit school. My mum moved to the countryside at this point. She had been working on a high-end job as a recruitment manager in London. And then she lost her job and moved to Glastonbury. And then she became a born-again Christian, right? And just as an interesting arc of my journey, because I'd always been, like I said, I'd always been a questioner, and I'd always been loving adventure. Like, I was always very adventurous and into nature. And I can remember sitting on the floor when I must have been about 7 or 8, and listening to my stomach, listening to my inner self, and thinking, how do I create silence in meditation? And then got distracted and was running off. But I always remember this. So even as a kid, I was always questioning things. And I think, really and truly, I believe all of us, it's in our pathway to question, because it's kind of like, nobody can actually tell you who you are. You can only ever discover who you are from looking within yourself. And if anyone else tells you who you are, it's just a label that you've been given by somebody else.
And also, you look at children, right? Children love to ask questions, right? So we're born with this innate curiosity to know what is going on around us. So you see, you know, even at babies at a young age, a lot of them will just stare when they hear noises, like where that's come from. And then we get taught, and I think certain cultures even more strongly, kind of like you were saying, to like be seen, not heard. We get taught to not speak out or ask questions too much. And I get it, you know, some people come from cultures where it's like they've moved to a place and they want to keep their head down. But what that does is it kind of stunts our own curiosity to ask questions, because we're too scared to either be different to the pack that we came from or misunderstood. And those are two traits of human nature that we try and avoid for like psychological safety. Is we never want to be seen as different, or we don't like to be seen as misunderstood, and we try and fight back against that.
So like for me growing up, because I moved so many times, and I went to like inner city London school, to primary countryside village school, to like very well-to-do boarding school, to a different type of well-to-do boarding school, and then I went to like a boarding school for children with dyslexia for a period of time, and then I went to like a rural secondary school, and then I got kicked out of that school, and then I went to a referral unit boarding school for children that was all over the country, who like from Liverpool, Birmingham, London, Bristol, kids who had been kicked out of school. Just a lot of really misunderstood kids. None of the kids in there were really like bad, just a lot of misunderstood kids. And it was crazy because there was kids from the age of 8 at that school to the age of 15. And it was a small school, but having those different experiences of education, like I really feel like I was very failed by the British education institution, right? But what was interesting is I experienced lots of different windows of it, right? And like, you know, city, country, private, public, referral unit. And like, you know, I really felt like the private schools gave more structure around how to process information. The public schools gave more, this is what you should think, this is how you should think. Right. And as a questioner in classes, I was so passionate to learn. And if you look through the rest of my life, I've just been on a journey of learning, right? So I think to myself, I was very misunderstood as a kid because I wanted to learn. I was so passionate to learn. And I would ask a lot of questions, and I'd get in trouble all the time by teachers saying, that's off the curriculum. But I was like, no, but if you explain to me about what's happening here relates to what's happening there, and actually did that information link to this information? Like I'm trying to bring together. Yeah, put this jigsaw puzzle of reality together, right? And often I would go off the curriculum. So I'd often get in trouble for asking too many questions. And because I eventually went back to using my right hand, but I became ambidextrous, and then using my right hand, I still was not moving as fast as other kids. So, you know, one of the ways that I learned quicker rather than writing was through communication, through asking questions, and I would absorb information and store information. But moving around, so I experienced these different education systems, and then the referral unit school I went to was not about teaching children anything. It was really just about entertaining them, distracting them until they leave. And most kids that have gone to a referral unit are going to leave school with very little self-awareness, very little education, and are more likely going to fall into the wrong tracks of life, especially because a lot of those kids are bright kids who have been misunderstood. And if you're bright and misunderstood and not very well educated in society, chances are you're probably going to turn to criminality at some stage. And my journey, again, I know I'm jumping around a little bit as a non-linear story, but, you know, my journey, as my mum became born-again Christian in Glastonbury. Glastonbury is like a new age, mystical, spiritual part of Britain, right? And so my mum became Christian there. Before, she was probably a bit more new age. So I was always having these sort of more expansive internal dialogues. You know, I always believed that there was something beyond just the physical, right? I always believed in God. I just didn't have a name for God, and I just didn't really have a structure for it. And my mum became Christian, and I tried to really take it on, but it just always gave me more questions. I was like, I don't really get, if that's that, why does that like that? And if that's that, why is that like that?
Do you think that's more common of the generation we're coming into now, where maybe the last couple, and again, going back to that point of a lot of, especially in my example, a lot of my previous generations people, they did move country for a lot of the time for setting up a better life. But as part of that, that also meant, okay, we're stepping into a new culture, a new zone, a new bunch of people that are not us. So we're outsiders. So let's not kick up a fuss about stuff. And part of that, going back to that thing about not asking questions, is, do you find that that generation weren't asking as many of these questions that you're kind of asking now?
Definitely. I think that generation very much tried to integrate as much as possible. And I think it is really challenging if you come from somewhere else and you go to another place. How do you keep your culture and also learn to respect, embrace, and share with the new culture, right? I think it's a big challenge. So a lot of times people come to a new place and they fully let go of like their culture and take on this new culture, and then become something that is not necessarily their essence anymore. You know, not necessarily, they've lost, you know, especially if you stop speaking your language, you've lost like part of the color of your journey, you know. And I, you know, even now looking at us as human beings, right? Like our different hair, eye shapes, skin tones, facial features, really it gives us a picture of the migrational patterns that our ancestors have been on the earth. And our languages we speak, right? It's like the color of how we can express our emotions and our thoughts in different ways. You know, I speak English relatively well, right? And I speak a little bit of other languages, right? And whenever I travel, I try to take on different languages and learn different aspects of different culture. And then I utilize these different words in my day-to-day life, right? Because I think other languages sometimes have more effective ways of saying stuff, you know? So I try and then bring together different things like that, you know? Like sometimes if I'm saying, let's go, let's move on, I might say it in Arabic, it's like, yalla.
Yeah.
Or I might say it in Spanish, vámonos.
Vamos,
Yeah, you know, I like it sometimes more than saying, let's go. You know, I like bringing in these other dynamics, you know.
It's interesting, you know, another thing you were saying, it just got me thinking, when you're talking about how our kind of like various facial features, the hair, etc., brings out that kind of history of where our lineage has gone. And it's so true when you think about it. You know, of course, there are the big differences where someone, say, from East Asia is obviously, well, not obviously, but often looks very different to, say, someone from Canada or Alaska. But then when you think about the kind of unconscious biases that we set, and not in a bad way, but you'd be like, oh, yeah, they're definitely Italian just by looking, but they'll be the exact same skin color as maybe someone from Greece. But you're like, oh no, they're definitely Italian. And it's because built in there's certain traits that we, and as humans, we always try and categorize because it just makes our brains are designed to simplify as much as we can. Otherwise it'll be an overload. But, or even if, you know, I've had where I've told people my background and they're like, oh, no way. Like you look way more Egyptian or something. And yeah, it's funny, even when the skin color is roughly the same shade, we will then go that step further and be like, yeah, we look at facial features and through that we already have an opinion of where we think that person is from. That's so interesting.
And I think that is partly it, right? If you can see lines, you know, when I look at my children's faces, I can see my parents' faces. And I see my missus' family faces, right? Like you see elements. So there is that line, right? There's definitely a physiological line that we can see within our faces that tell us a story of our ancestral journeys, right? In reference to my questioning of things, right? So religion became a question for me as I went through life. And also ethnicity became a question, you know, like how, you know, as a child, I thought if I looked up an English person or a British person, I wasn't going to see anyone who looked like me, right? So then I didn't totally relate to being British. Even though I'm in Britain, I was born here, lived here all my life, speak English, because of the culture I was in, very much persecuted the way I was. I didn't really feel like I identify as British. And when I was about 15, I moved back to London. And so I spent probably from 5 to 15. I used to visit my dad at times, but predominantly for those 10 years, I spent more in English environments where I was the other. And then I came back to London and was just like in this mad, crazy melting pot of cultures from all over the world again. And then in those environments, other black children and mixed race children like myself were like, yo, you're black, but bruv, you don't really know certain things. Like, what's going on? So because I had moved so much, one of the gifts that I gained from that was the ability to adapt very quickly. So at that stage in my life, I adapted, and what I could see of black culture was predominantly a lot of negative things. So I kind of quickly slipped into hanging out with kids and smoking weed and, you know, chasing girls and trying to be cool, like on a certain level, right? So I tried to fit into this identity that was not being formed by me, but was being formed by music, film, billboards, you know, like there was these different sort of like guiding lights that was forming what I could perceive as black culture.
Do you think, looking at the example of you, but also the people that you were hanging around with, what was the mindset? Did that come from a sense of, well, we're not accepted here, there, and this other place, So we're going to take those stereotypes that you've given us and I'm going to go all in on it. Do you think it came from almost a, I don't want to say spite, but like, okay, I'll show you what it means to be the stereotypes you're saying? Or do you think it just came from the sense of like, well, this is the only place I can turn to?
Yeah, I think it's even more, it's more unconscious, like you said. I think it's more unconscious. It's kind of like, this is how you're meant to be. And then people just tend to follow, right? People follow. If you haven't grown up with a strong family who instill education, values, principles, self-awareness, history, spiritual awareness, emotional awareness, intellectual growth, physical mastery, if you're not getting that stuff in the home, chances are you're not going to find it so easily at school. And so what you are going to find is the loud voices that affect the young of whatever nationality, is your musicians, is your films, right? Like, you know, where is there a type of musical culture that promotes violence on on people, right? Like rap has become a window that promotes that, right? And I think, so for me, when you look at the essence of rap, yeah, it's rhythm and poetry, right? Yeah. This goes back to the ancients, know that? Yeah. Right? It goes back to the ancients sitting around the fire and just rapping, making poems about the beauty of the day, right? And you know, we can trace that all the way back to ancient Africa, where people would say poems about nature, about love, about, you know, history and culture. But see, rap got taken over by corporate capitalists, and then what they began to do with it in America is they started to form it into promote materialism, male chauvinistic behavior, like destructive black on black crime. Like they promoted these ghettoized concepts, right?
Things that like invoke emotion. It's kind of like how news publishing went from being an objective source of information to when it became capitalist, it was like, well, we now need to take a side because that's what generates attention amongst viewers, because now they're going to pay for this source, right? And like the more it's easier to generate, or it's more powerful to generate negative emotions in people than positive, and that's why you get, you know, that's why the tabloid does so well, right? Because it's kind of, it ignites this either fear, anger, danger, whatever it is. That's the, yeah, I think it fits into the same thing. Like if it brings this out on people pay more attention to it.
Totally. And I think, you know, from my years of questioning, right, is that we're all multidimensional beings of energy, pure energy. We're physiologically related and we're spiritually all connected. You know, we're part of the divine consciousness of the universe. We're individual drops within the ocean of that consciousness, and we're also a manifestation of the great ocean, right?
I love that.
But within that, there's so many different ways we can identify. You can identify as the body. You can identify as your emotions. You could identify as the mind, or you could identify as your essence or spirit.
I mean, nowadays people identify as anything, but
now there's a whole load of new variations of identification, right? But what I was going to say is this, on this plane right now, is there's lots of chess games going on. There's financial chess games going on. There's border chess games going on, right? There's tech chess games going on. And when I say games, it's like there's people who are playing games to win. And if you don't realize you're playing a game, you've already lost. You're being played. And so if somebody can make you a non-player, then they've won the game, right? So we live in a society that is based on rules, but most of us have never really been taught the rules, right? So how can you play the game properly if you've never been taught the rules? So on so many layers, on so many levels, I think no matter what your ethnicity is, whether you're male or female, where you're coming from, is knowledge of self is fundamental to discover who you are, so that you know that you're playing the game that you came to play. Because we're all the heroes of our own journey, right? And we're here to share and collectively work together, but we are the hero of our own journey. No one can define you but you define yourself. You were born with skills and gifts, strengths and weaknesses within you. You have to learn how to utilize your strengths, how to heal your weaknesses, and then live by your own meaning and purpose, right? And what is your own meaning and purpose? And your meaning and purpose is, how do you serve the collective? And how do we grow together, right? But only you can find that out inside yourself. If somebody else tells you who you are, somebody else limits your perspective of what you can achieve, tells you that you are this race or this gender or this type of person, or you are defined because of the job you do, you're going to always be limited by somebody else's perspective. And like I said, we're playing in games of chess. So if somebody else has defined your piece, then you're never going to manifest your own higher qualities and your own gifts. Someone else is moving you, right? And so I went through this journey. So like in my teens and my late 20s, I kind of fell into these negative box identities around black culture, you know. And again, like I went to college, took a business administration course in college because I was like, yep, I want to do business. I want to make money. I want to grow a successful business. But I couldn't read and write very well because my schooling had been so messed up. Like if I'd had the right support, I should have gone and studied anthropology, sociology, history, and probably performing arts, because they would have related to my long-term life journey, right? They would have been those were my passions. But I didn't understand my passions at that age. And I was just in my intellect of like my ego head of like, yo, I want to make money. That's going to give me purpose, right? So I tried to do that. Didn't really like it. Spent more time hanging out in the common room, playing blackjack and playing pool and table tennis, right? But wasn't doing anything up to no good. I got kicked out of college for suspicion of selling weed, right? I wasn't even selling weed. Some of the people I knew were, but I wasn't. So got kicked out of college. So it's like now I've really been put onto these odd tracks. So I started doing some like work. So I did like sales jobs and stuff like that. And then some of my other friends who were selling weed were like, bro, you may as well come and do this. So I fell into that path, right? And was just, you know, living this identity that had kind of been shaped for me and given this is all you can do, right? But because I had been through so many different environments, you know, I've been in working class environments, I've been in upper class environments, I've been in middle class environments, I've been around predominantly British, European people, I've been around Caribbean people, African people, mixed race, heritage people. I wasn't stuck in that was all I knew, you know. And so after a period of time, through different enlightening, challenging, life-changing circumstances, I had certain awakenings that kind of made me realize, hold on, I'm more than this. This is not my path. And then I went on this journey of really seeking knowledge of self. And my journey of knowledge of self was a manifestation of my physical martial arts training that's always given me this backbone, it's given me identity, it's given me strength of character. It's taught me how to grow and develop through hard work and ethic. And then I went on this deep journey of like studying history and culture. And when I started studying Caribbean and African history, I was like, what? None of this is ever taught in the mainstream. I didn't know African civilization was more advanced than European civilization if we go back to the medieval age. I didn't have any clue about colonialism or imperialism, right, or the British Empire. And so I started to study all of this history. You know, I spent a lot of time reading psychology as well. And I took myself to internal therapy, right? Like I read some Tony Robbins books, Unlimited Power, one that he wrote with an African-American guy called Joseph McLennan. And that really helped me start to reform the way I use my brain, right? And I learned a lot of NLP, what was like neuro-linguistic programming, learning to kind of have more of a positive outlook, learning how to not be a victim of my circumstances, how to learn from my circumstances. And I really got deep into life coaching and studying history. And then my life kind of took a whole new path. I kind of gave up the pursuit of trying to just make money and get a job. And I became really passionate about connecting to my soul, connecting to my essence. Like, what was I really about? Why was I here? Who are we as human beings, right? How did the world come together? And that became this adventure I went on.
What was that turning point that really took it from, all right, yeah, no, I'm diving into this because it's out of an interest area for me, to be like, this isn't just something that I want to learn about. This is something that I need to bring into the frame of people's understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I got to this crunch point. You know, I was basically became homeless at 17, left home, you know, wasn't living the way my mum would like me to live. And so I was homeless for a period of time, ended up living in the London hostel scene, and then eventually got my own place just before I was 18. And so I had no family in London. And so the only people I was really around was people that were similar to me, who were coming from traumatized backgrounds, misunderstood, struggling with different things, and a lot of people who were into criminality and stuff like that. And then I sort of started to find myself in that pathway. But I was around a lot of just people who were not honest. They were not necessarily good people. They and just a lot of bad vibes going on. It was also very glamorous because I was around also people who were whose family owned restaurants and stuff like that. And so like some of the people I used to hang out with were like just they loved taking drugs and partying, and then some of the other people I was with liked providing drugs, right? And collecting money that hadn't been done, right? So I was in this weird world of like show business and entertainment and drugs and crime and criminality, right? So it was all exciting, and it directly related to the music I was listening to and the films that I'd been watching. You know, I grew up seeing, you know, New Jack City, Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society. Like these films, as much as they highlighted these negative paths, they still kind of became somewhat guiding paths of like, this is how we should talk. This is what you should value. You know, like, you know, all of the rap and stuff that I was listening to was having a very negative impact in my identity and my belief system. But anyway, I found myself onto this path, and one of my friends was trying to do a deal. He got robbed at gunpoint. We were together, right? And a tussle went down. I managed to take some of the drugs back, give it back to my friend. This gun was flying around, never went off, but it was this experience of like, this guy had a gun. He ended up running off, nothing, and none of us got shot or got hurt. But it was this, okay, we're on this crunch point now. And the guys who did the crime, on a crime, right? Because my friend was selling drugs. Right. They decided to rob him, right? But because I stopped them being able to do it, one of the guys was like, right, I'm going to kill him. So I had this one guy who was older than me, who was now talking about wanting to do me something. And then in my head, I'm like, well, does that mean I've got to do him something before he does me something, right? So that was going on, right? I broke up from a girl at the time. You know, I was smoking too much weed. She wanted different things. I didn't even know how to give it. I was, you know, in a confused place around women. I'd been seeing a lot of different women. Found one woman I really liked, and then she didn't want to stay with me. So that caused another challenge. I really realized I lacked knowledge at this point. And again, the people who I considered friends were not really my friends. They were dishonest. They were not loyal. They didn't really have my back. They were trying to get me into more trouble and more problems. So I didn't have a lot of support. And then I was waiting outside a bookshop one day to sell some drugs. And I realized, man, I probably lack knowledge. I don't know how to deal with all these challenges like going on. And I was smoking a lot of weed at the time, and I'd been taking certain like XEs and stuff like that. And so I was also struggling with all the questions I was asking. I was also struggling with like, what is reality? I was at this crazy crunch point where I came to a crossroads, whereas one road someone was going to kill me, another road I was going to kill somebody else, another road was I'm going to go jail, right? Another road was I'm going to go mad, because it was like the weed was just causing paranoia in my brain.
And then you got these like existential questions that you actually are keen to know.
So it was a proper life and death crossroads. Anyway, I was outside this shop. This guy was late. And then I was like, let me just go and look in here. I realized I probably lack knowledge, man. So I went into this bookshop and I made a prayer in my head not to a particular God, but just to the universe, to my source. I prayed, look, please give me some guidance. I realize I lack knowledge. I'm lost. Don't know where to go. I want to try and understand reality better. So I kind of made this prayer, and then I unconsciously walked to any bookshelf and took a book. And the book I picked up was Unlimited Power, A Black Choice, written by Tony Robbins and Joseph McClendon, right? And I took this book away, and I couldn't really read that well at that time. And it took me probably like 8 months to get through this book, because I'd keep reading the same page again until it went in, right? And it really helped me start to redevelop how I processed information, and it awoke this hunger for knowledge. And I went back into that same shop like 8-9 months later, once I'd finished the book. I thought, yeah, let me go and look in that, what other books have they got on that shelf? So I went there, and there was like all politics books. And I was like, oh. So I asked one of the people who worked in the shop, I said, oh, I found this book here the other day, well, a few months ago. I'm trying to look for other books. They were like, no, it would never have been on that shelf. She goes, like, it would be upstairs in the self-help section. She's like, that's politics. And I was like, no, I found it here. She was like, well, I don't know what it would have been doing there. And I even just remember thinking then, wow, I definitely had some guidance, man. Like, I made a prayer, and then I got a book that actually helped me.
Otherwise, you could have ended up with a maybe a French politics book.
It might have taken me a different direction. Yeah, do you know what I mean? Like, I end up reading French politics. Maybe it would have taken me down a different path. I might have moved to France. You never know. But around that same time, I'd got offered this job opportunity to work as a runner for a music label, working with this Rasta called Johnny Laws, and he had found certain artists like Mark Morrison, and him and another guy had done All Saints and stuff, and he managed certain rock, heavy metal bands and stuff. So I used to sell him weed, and he was like, look, stop selling drugs, come and work for me, and I'll just give you an office junior role. And like, he was drinking brandy from morning to night, and he was smoking weed all the time, right? And then he would be like in a bit of a comatose state most of the day, and then he'd have a meeting, he'd switch on, the person he had a meeting with would leave, and he'd go back into this mad state, right? And like, he didn't actually actively teach me his stuff and show me a different path, but what he did do is he gave me this space as a young man in my early 20s. He gave me a space for me to get up early every morning, to come, I'd clean the office, I'd go and do his run-ins, and then sitting in this office, often just twiddling my thumbs, being like, what do I even do here? I found this next book, and this next book was called Slaves That Abolished Slavery, and it was about the 100-year war between the British and the Maroons, and Africans who like indigenous Caribbeans, indigenous Jamaicans, and Africans who had refused to be enslaved and who had escaped, and then had created a free community in Jamaica. And it was this story about how the British kept trying to capture them, and then these Maroons would use guerrilla warfare and just wipe them out. And it was like letters written back to the governor being like, we need more troops because these guys are just not submitting, we want to catch them. And then I started to realize, oh my gosh, a lot of what I've been struggling with in my life directly relates to certain people who have been trying to oppress me because of the history that I'm connected to. I didn't know any of this story, right? But it was affecting my day-to-day life. And I didn't even realize at that time that my grandma's family line, that we're Maroons, right? So I didn't even realize that I was reading about my own family history, my own story. And then that again just started to awaken this knowledge and this thirst and hunger to learn about African history and Caribbean history. And I realized what we're told in mainstream stories around history, around perception about reality, is very far from the truth. And the more we start to dig, the more alternate realities and alternate perspectives we have that are written in stone, there's anthropology, there's archaeology, and there's evidence for it, right? And I started to just realize, wow, life is way more interesting than we're often given perspective to believe, right? And often we think about, we live in the West today, it's 2024, and we think that civilization has reached this peak, and we're at the highest peak now it's ever been. But actually, if you step off the colonial Eurocentric wagon and you look at the broad spectrum of human history, they say that we've been on Earth for roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years. That's the accepted perspective now in anthropological terms. We're roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years old. I would theorize that we're probably even older than that. We just haven't found certain evidence to fully back it well enough yet. And 200,000 to 300,000 years of history, humans have been on Earth, and civilizations have peaked and crashed, peaked and crashed, peaked and crashed. We're encouraged to believe that, we were all hunter-gatherers and we just lived wildly free naturally off the earth until, 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. And then certain people started farming and then civilization birthed from that. I currently don't believe that story, right? There's so much other evidence now that actually civilizations have peaked and fallen many times before that. And there's much more broader perspectives about how human life came to be on Earth. And so for me, my questioning has continued to take me on a journey of discovering and seeking answers to more of these questions.
You talk about, I want to get onto how you talk about the hero of your journey, and that links so nicely into, some of the filmmaking you've done to bring out some of this content. But something that you mentioned there got me thinking. It's quite interesting, and I wonder what you think. So, there's this concept that, whether you are religious or whether you're atheist, there's this understanding of this kind of like beautiful harmony or this chaos, that's this sort of constructed chaos in the way the world works, right? So it kind of fits together, even though it's a big mess. It's like a beautiful mess. So this concept of our understanding of our history being incorrect, and there's been many formations, and there's still people in the world who believe the earth is flat, etc. Why do you think that kind of constructive chaos has allowed to be, where our version of what's happened isn't even the truth? Is that done because having that version of truth is what has allowed humans to survive in the way they have? Or is it the case that, is it a sanity thing, or is it for people like you and other interested people to go and try and find out the truth? Why has it been allowed that like a false version of reality is basically or a false version of history is what we're like now understanding?
Well, I think in a simplified answer to a really broad question, right? A really good question, is that the winners of wars tell the history, right?
Yeah.
So the winners tell the story. And if the winners cheated their way to win, then they're never going to tell you the broadest best perspective of the truth, right? There's a famous ancient African quote, and it says, "Until the lions tell the story of the hunt, only the hunter will tell you the story." Yeah. And it's always that. It's like, how do we combine perspectives? I think being of mixed heritage in this incarnation, right, it's really encouraged me to sort of draw parallels and draw bridges between my European ancestry and my African ancestry. And it's taken a long time to learn to become at peace with both, and to be grounded in both, and to know that actually, that story goes back to one. Like they say that we all come from Africa, right? So that line is the same, no matter what your complexion is now. We've all got dark brown, curly-haired African ancestors, right? And we've just mutated and adapted based on environment, mixing of genes, and adaptation. We've adapted to different environments, so we look slightly different because of that. But we all lead back to that tree. That's the trunk, right? That's where human history has the longest span of time on Earth. And some parts of the Earth, cultures developed in abundant lands. So like, if me and you are chilling by a tree and there's just loads of mangoes, we're not going to be fighting over the mangoes, right? We're going to be like, yo, you have one, let me pull it for you. Yeah, how about we share the mangoes? Let's just enjoy this food right now. But if we are developing our culture in a place where there's hardly any food, right? Like, and there's one little piece of food we find, we're probably going to fight for it. And actually, it's not necessarily going to be just a fight. You'll kill me or I'll kill you so I can get the food. So, abundance or scarcity creates different cultural windows and outlooks. And if you've come from abundance, you're probably going to be more open, more sharing, more giving. If you've come from scarcity, you're probably going to be more closed and more hostile and more fighty and more driven, right?
Although there's the idea of that greed hypothesis, right? The greed effect, which is that we, in some societies where people have more than they need, whereas then you'll go to somewhere like, my grandparents are from India, and you go there and people are actually very giving of the little they have because they have enough to survive. I think there's also an upper side where people get to a point where they become even greedier the more they get, because psychologically you got more to lose by giving it. And so there's this human tendency that they're quite, we have enough to be sufficient. Above that, we start to become generous, but then there's very quickly a cutoff where that generosity then actually becomes to more greed, because it's, well, I got more than you, so I don't actually gain from giving anything to you. If anything, I got more to lose even opening my doors.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. But again, what I'm saying is if you come from an abundant environment.
Yeah.
So when you're dealing with greed, you're talking about you've created abundance because you acquired.
Right.
So like if I go and collect all the mangoes off the tree and I've got them now and you want a mango, I might not be so giving. But if we're both chilling on the tree and it's just they're falling and we're eating, no one's did the work to acquire it. So I think from that perspective, and we can see lots of empires developed, and people who push empires or kingdoms, they tend to have an ideology or a belief system, right? That sometimes they may push on the population. And if you look at history, like British history, for example, right, it's had dictators after dictators after dictators. We often don't think about history like that in Britain, but you've had conquerors. You've had savage conquerors come in and conquer Britain again and again and again and again, right? William the Conqueror. People don't think about William the Conqueror. He was French mixed with Viking ancestry. He's a British He's one of the monarchs, one of the ancestors of the British family, right? Or the British royal family. But the British royal family, they're more German biologically than British, right? If we're going to really go into British history, who are the original Brits? The Celts. The Celtic tribes were the original Brits. The Anglos came from Europe and conquered. The Saxons came from Europe and conquered. The Franks, the Dukes, they came here and conquered, right? The Vikings came here and conquered. So if you've got foreign people who come and they conquer, chances are they're going to be dictating their perspective on the people they've conquered, right? And so for me, when we look back through history, you've had different groups of people who have conquered and taken control of land and taken control of civilization. And the best way to maintain power is to set the parameters. We go back to the game I was talking about earlier, right? If you set the parameters for the game and you're the only one that knows the rules, chances are you're going to win. If you set the parameters for the game and somebody else knows the rules, but you set the parameters, chances are you're going to win. If you set the parameters for the rules, you both know the rules, you both know the game, but you cheat, chances are you're going to win, right? And unfortunately, because of that greed paradigm you're talking about, you've had people and cultures stem from this greed paradigm, and then they've created worldviews. What's fascinating about today is that we're living in the information age, right? So if we jump back 100 years, the information you could acquire was based on the culture and the people you're around. Maybe the access to libraries or temples, you could find information, but it was very much not open to everyone. Not everyone could get it, right? You might gain new information because a wanderer or a traveler came in and brought new information, right? Now, a kid in the remotest part of Siberia can have an iPhone and have access to history in Africa, Asia, Europe, America, right on his phone. So right now we're in the flux of access to knowledge and information. What we need is to have discernment now, because now there's truth, insanity, fiction, and reality all merged into information online. So we really need to tap into discernment now. How can we all be detectives? Right? Realize that reality is not clear. Like even the academics, they don't have all the answers, right? We need to join our minds together, right? And continue questioning and look at what is our collective story. So my journey as a questioner, as a truth seeker, as I started to read these books and I started to discover more history, that led me eventually to start going on journeys to Africa. And I started making films about African history and culture. And then the more I traveled, the more countries I went to, the more questions I would ask, the more elders I would meet, the more ancient sites I would go and visit, the more knowledge I would acquire, the more questions I would have from the answers I've acquired, right? And so I've been to over 40 countries around the world now. There's still lots to learn. There's still lots of more places I want to go and visit. But I'm just slowly continuing to unpick this story, unpick our reality. You have people who are creating products, I could list many, but there's lots of poisonous food products, right? That literally are causing cancer, that is causing you to age quicker, that literally it rots your body from inside out. But people are selling it because it becomes addictive and they make money. And the more they can get you addicted to their products, the more money they make. So these are insipidous. These should not be things that should be encouraged in society, right? We should be looking at how to make things and sell things that are going to uplift people, empower one another, right? And that should learn how to monetize things that are going to empower one another. So again, for me, it's like, how do we really take accountability for our life journey and connect to the essence of who we are? And only each of us individually can do that. Like no one can tell you who you are. You have to go into yourself and really understand your story, understand your ancestral story, understand your own spiritual story, and then be present to the unfolding of your reality.
We didn't even get into some of the things that I know that you're working on now. Some of the filmmaking stuff. I know there's some of the books here. If you want to briefly touch on what is that aim with the filmmaking that you've gone into, and even in your writing, and then I'll put the links for people to be able to check it out, and for sure there'll be a part 2. But what's the big aim next?
I've got to this stage in my life where I've kind of begun to bring together the different things I've been doing, right? The filmmaking came out of this quest for knowledge of self. And then the more I would discover, the more I wanted to share, because I realized, like, actually, the more my struggles is a reflection of other people's struggles. You know, whether it becomes down to, like, how do you define identity? What's it about being a man? How is it about respecting women? What about raising children? You know, these have been sort of like the questions that come up for my life, right? Like, I'm a student of life. And so in the films I've made a lot of films that are kind of like telling parts of the ancient story, telling forgotten histories that have been missing from our collective story. And I've done a lot of independent projects. So with the right financial backing, there's lots more stories I want to tell. And now the books I've gone into writing now. So I've written 2 books so far. And I've got a third one that's on the way. But I've written 2 books. The first one is called Achieving Success. And this is like 5 simple steps about how to live your meaning and purpose, and how to turn your passions into a life journey that can be monetized and that can give you joy, happiness, reward, and success, right? But it's 5 simple steps. It's a short, easy to read book, but there's lots of good exercises in it. My next book I've put together is called Decoding Misinformation, How to Find Truth in the Information Age. And this has really come from the journey of researching films, histories and projects, right? It's really also a very timely book because we're now living in the rise of AI and deep fakes, where, you know, you can't believe anything you see online nowadays, right? You really have to have discernment. So whatever you discover, if you find a post that's telling you ice cream is the cure to, you know, short-sightedness, right? And you can see these scientific studies linked to it, don't just believe what you've seen. Go and follow the trail. Like, which website first promoted that? Was it an ice cream website? Because they were just promoting that to sell their ice cream, right? So actually, you need to follow the trail. Like, who paid for this? Was it only 10 people in the scientific study? Was it only 2 people? Was it thousands of people? Like, you know, you need to go and how do you have discernment? And this book really encourages each of us to be a detective, to realize that we are all walking libraries of our own experience, how to be aware of what your own perspective is, your own personal biases, cultural biases, how to be a philosopher, to question things in reality, and how to really know the difference between what you're informed of, that could be true or false, what you believe, that really is what you've aligned yourself to, but that could also be true or false, what you know through trial, error, testing, validation, what you intuitively feel. It's very important. Like, what's your gut feeling? How do you learn how to trust and define your insights for your own internal truth-seeking knowledge, right? And for me, it's about really important to how do you know the difference between those different aspects, right? Again, really important, powerful books. I know the new book I'm working on at the moment is basically about the spiritual dimensions of Muay Thai. So I've been practicing Muay Thai for nearly 3 decades. And we're looking at kind of the ancient history of Muay Thai and Muay Boran, and looking at kind of the Hindu, Buddhist epics and myths that relate to that martial arts, you know, and how, you know, true essence of martial arts can be amazing tools for personal development, self-transformation and enlightenment.
That's fascinating. That's definitely well, actually all 3 of them. I'm going to get a copy of those off you. Let me know when the Muay Thai one comes out. I did not do Muay Thai, but I did karate, but I feel like there's a lot of lessons you can learn from that discipline element. And yeah, I mean, thank you for just sharing everything that you did, right? I think we've only scratched the surface. We've obviously met before, and I know just how much knowledge you have to share and what people can actually learn from it, right? Because it's not just about, okay, I'm well read. It's kind of like, okay, well, this is something that can get people discerning information and thinking and figuring out who they really are. So always grateful of the time. We have a closing tradition, which is that if you were to write one sentence on a piece of paper that gets passed on to either your own future generation or the future generation as a whole, which they would read and live by, what would that message say?
Yeah, it's a good one. So I've got a couple in mind. Let's just see how I freestyle it and let it roll. So in a nutshell, I would say self-knowledge is discovered in every step, not the destination. You know, like the adventure of life is in every step you take. It's not in just the destination, right? So enjoy the journey. You know, you are on a journey throughout your own life. Absorb that knowledge, absorb those experiences, keep learning, and create the life that you've come here to create.
Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning into that episode. If you did find that valuable or entertaining or inspiring in any way, then feel free to share it with others. Also, don't forget to hit that like button, not to make me happy, but every time you do that, it increases the scope of this video, and the bigger the scope, the better the quality of the guests and the production that you get. Also, comment on anything that was talked about. Nuakai delivered so much value in the episode. If there's anything you disagree with, agree with, want to expand on, then feel free to comment. I'll make sure to get back to you and pass the message on to him. Apart from that, here's another video for you to check out in case you can't wait till next week. Otherwise, hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so, and I'll see you next time.